I've been on the hunt for a budget-friendly smartphone which is going to offer me a full smartphone experience without breaking the bank. Now this sounds like it should be fairly straightforward, but there's actually some rules. I must not spend a penny more than £100. So I know what you're thinking. Use the £100 as a down payment on a phone contract. Well, that sounds simple, right? Unfortunately, that's not allowed. As we navigate our way through a cost of living crisis, this £100 should be the entire cost of the smartphone, pretty much ruling out any contract options. So I did what most people would do and I headed over to wish.com. Now, there's many options on Wish, from literally as little as £40. However, I personally am a big believer of the phrase pay cheap, pay twice. So here's my second rule that I must follow. I must purchase a smartphone from a reputable brand, a brand that I can actually trust. Now, another caveat is the smartphone must be brand new and come with a warranty. So the rules are, it must cost less than £100, it must be brand new from a retailer, and it must be a full smartphone. After less than an hour, I stumbled across the Oppo A16, a smartphone which runs Android 11 and offers slightly more than you'd expect from this budget, including a triple camera setup. 2 weeks ago, I picked up the Oppo A16 and I've been using it daily since. And the question you may have on your mind, is a £100 Oppo A16 one of the best smartphones for the money? Now, if you follow the journey of brands like Apple and Samsung, the price has been increasing, but the packaging has been decreasing. Removing accessories and ports seems to be a trend which isn't going anywhere. And at £100, I was actually expecting very little. In some cases, I wasn't even sure they'd supply the phone. Not only have they kept providing consumers with the full charging equipment required, they've gone even further, including a case within the box. And it was shortly after this I noticed that the phone comes pre-installed with a perfectly aligned and fitted screen protector. So a device which costs a tenth of the price of Apple's flagship comes with 4 extras which would normally set you back the cost of the Oppo A16 alone. And yes, I said 4, and you'll see why later. So what does £100 actually get you in 2023? Let's start with the display. The Oppo A16 comes with a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with 480 nits of brightness. The resolution comes in at 720 by 1600, but let's forget about the specs. How does it actually look in the real world? Now, it's obviously not the best, but it's far from the worst. Browsing the operating system is fine, colours are very vibrant, and everything feels rather responsive. Now, if you watch a lot of video content like I do, you might notice the same things that I do. For example, when watching YouTube videos, I can't help but notice there appears to be some artificial sharpening of imagery. If you look closely throughout the OS, this is actually visible, but mainly noticed by myself when consuming video content. It's certainly not going to rival any flagship device, however it's more than I'd expect for the price. Whilst we're dancing around the subject of video content, now is a good time to actually mention the speakers as well. They're okay, nothing to write home about, but they're actually rather loud. They do sound a little bit flat, so again, fine for content consumption, but I wouldn't expect to entertain a party with it. Again, can you complain for £100? Now, in the hands, the phone actually feels lightweight, but rather solid. It is made of plastic, but don't let that put you off. I wouldn't recommend dropping it, but I also wouldn't expect the thing to just break too easily. And just remember, the phone does come with a case, which I do recommend, as this reflective exterior would most likely be prone to scratches. Oppo have actually done a nice job here in terms of design. It doesn't look how I'd expect it to for where it sits in the market. Under the hood is 3GB of RAM, specifically for the 32GB model. If you go for a higher storage variant, you do actually get an additional 1GB of RAM, taking it to 4GB in total. If 32GB seems a little low, you can actually increase the storage via a microSD card. On top of the generous accessories included, Oppo have opted to include a 3.5mm headphone jack for those who still require one. And yes, they even include a standard pair of earphones in the box. From a hardware perspective, I'm actually very impressed with the design, and despite the fact that it's a mid-2021 device, it just doesn't look or feel like it. So one area this device is rather weak is the cameras, not in quantity, but definitely in quality. The front of the device has an 8 megapixel selfie camera, which shoots video at 1080 at 30 frames per second. Now it's not awful, however it did struggle with white balance, regularly turning my magnolia coloured walls into a lime green. It does get better with the right lighting conditions, but it's passable at best for £100. I only really use the front facing camera to use the face detect to unlock feature. On the rear of the device, things start to get a little bit interesting. You get a 13 megapixel sensor as the main, a 2 megapixel macro camera and a 2 megapixel depth camera. This setup is referred to as triple cam by Oppo. Now whilst the cameras produce pretty low res imagery, it does have a feature called Pro. This gives you, the end user, full control of the camera's settings, including the ability to manually set white balance, ISO, shutter speed and even focal range. It also has specific modes for panoramic photos, time lapses and even macro shots. Personally, I'm not a huge smartphone photographer in all honesty. My mild usage of the cameras was a bit of a battle to avoid ending up with noisy images. Again, this depends entirely on your location, the lighting available and a few other variants. On the rear, things start to get interesting. You get a 13 megapixel sensor as the main, a 2 megapixel macro camera and a 2 megapixel depth camera. This setup is referred to as triple cam by Oppo. Now whilst the cameras produce pretty low res imagery, it does have a feature called Pro. This gives the user full control of the camera's settings, including the ability to manually set white balance, ISO, shutter speed and even focal range. It also has specific modes for panoramic photos, time lapses and even macro shots. Personally, I'm not a big smartphone photographer in all honesty. My mild usage of the cameras was a bit of a battle to avoid ending up with noisy images. Again, this is dependent on your location and the lighting available. The more light, the better quality images that this device will output. Now, the camera specs are below average, but hey, if all you're using the camera for is random pictures of your pets and kids, I'm sure they'll be okay. I would highly recommend checking the cameras out in person if cameras are a big factor in your decision making when it comes to purchasing a smartphone. The Oppo A16 runs Android 11 and it offers the standard Android experience, so if you've used this OS before, it'll feel very familiar to you. Despite being a budget end phone, the device is relatively quick. We're not talking super fast, but I never found myself frustrated with loading times. This is down to its octa-core CPU. Again, with this being a budget end device, there's not too many complaints for the money. So how long are you going to enjoy this phone for before you need to plug it in and charge it? Well, from my experience, battery life has actually been very, very good. With average use, I've easily managed a day and a half, and this is down to its generous 5000 mAh battery. The same size battery that Samsung use to power their higher end smartphones. This is a very generous battery. So should you buy the Oppo A16? Well, if money is tight, the A16 is a good smartphone. If gaming and photography are high on your requirement list, it might disappoint you. But if you just need a phone which offers a pleasant phone call experience, decent media consumption, and allows you to easily use your favourite apps, send emails, browse the web, etc., the A16 is a good shout. It's also not really embarrassing to pull it out of your pocket. Given the times, I specifically wanted to showcase a phone under £100. However, the A17 is available and it can be found online for as low as £120 if your budget can stretch to that. Times are hard for a lot of people right now, so if £100 is the very most you can afford, the A16 is a contender.